of what's known as rabbinical Judaism, right? The temple is destroyed. The rabbis, they start this council at Gemenia. Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Hillel are the founders. Rabbi Judah Hanasi, Judah the prince. What do we do now? So they decided we need to write down the oral law we talked about. The oral law needs to be written down. It became the first part of the Talmud, and then rabbis would comment upon the Talmud, the first part of the Talmud, which is called the Mishnah, and the commentaries are called the Gemara. Together, the Mishnah and the Gemara, these make up the Talmud, right? So this is the beginnings of rabbinical Judaism, or post-Second Temple Judaism. Of course, also at this point, the Roman emperor, he was the fifth Roman emperor, was named Nero. And Nero did not like Christians at all. In fact, he persecuted Christians. His reign ended around 68 of the Common Era, again, contemporary with the composition of the Gospel of Mark. Nero actually, according to the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, he actually burnt down, set ablaze a great part of the city of Rome. And the reason he did that is because he wanted to construct new architecture for himself. So he burnt down intentionally a major part of the city, and then he blamed it on the Christians of the city of Rome. So this is known as a false flag operation, right, where the government will do something and blame a minority within his country. So then it takes the focus off of him. And this happened, the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin, for example, to get America into the war, and other instances as well that we won't go into right now, but very common type of thing to do, governments in power, false flag operation. So this is what Nero did. He set a major part of the city of Rome on fire, and then he blamed the Christians. And Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus, they mentioned some of the horrific ways in which Nero would torture and execute the Christians living in the city. Also during this time, you have natural disasters, earthquakes at Pompeii, Naples, the Eastern Mediterranean. In 79, you have Mount Vesuvius, right, exploding. So these were seen by early Christians as portents of the end of time, right? Christians believed at the time of the Gospel of Mark's composition that all of these things meant that the end of time, what's known as the eschaton, right, in Greek, the eschaton, was imminent. It was about to happen, right? Isa alayhi salam had come. He was rejected. He was crucified according to Christians. He was resurrected. He promises to come again in the future, right? Then you have these natural disasters. You have Nero persecuting Christians. You have the temple being completely destroyed, right? So these were seen as major portents of the end of time. So you have to remember this. Mark is writing in this context. Mark believes, very much like Paul believed, that the end of time was in his lifetime. This is very, very apparent when you read the Pauline epistles. If you read the 14 epistles that are attributed to Paul, Paul actually only wrote 7 of them genuinely. The other 7 are forgeries in the name of Paul. But the central Pauline theme is that the end of time is going to happen very soon in his own lifetime. So Paul's advice on marriage, celibacy, divorce, slavery, all of that is predicated upon his belief in an immediate parousia, an immediate second coming of Isa alayhi salam. That's what he believed, and it didn't happen, right? Paul says we're going to be transformed in the twinkling of an eye, caught up in the clouds with the Lord. The very frame of the world is passing away. He tells people, don't even worry about getting married. You're not going to have enough time to enjoy yourselves. Don't even count on using your goods that you just bought in the marketplace, right? It's going to happen very, very quickly. Not in the sense of, relatively speaking, like the Prophet ﷺ said, Ana was kahatain, that I and the hour are like this. Relatively speaking, right? Because human beings have been on the earth for tens of thousands of years. But that's not how Paul is speaking here. Paul is saying in his own lifetime, the end of time will happen. And this is verifiably false, right? Paul made a major error here. So we can rule out Paul as being a true prophet, even by the standards of the Old Testament. The book of Deuteronomy says, if a would-be prophet says something will come to pass and it does not, then he is a false prophet. It's very simple. And it's very interesting. We talked about the book of Second Thessalonians. Second Thessalonians, which is not written by Paul, but written in the name of Paul, will actually try to delay the end of time to sort of save Paul some face. Very, very interesting. But that's outside the scope of this class. So anyway, the bottom line here is that the Markan Jesus, right, the Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, we'll call him the Markan Jesus, he also believes that the end of time is going to happen during his lifetime. He says in Mark chapter 9, he says, for example, there are some standing here that will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in great power, right? So an immediate second coming. There are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man, referring to himself, the second coming. He says the present generation will live to see it all. So these words were put into the mouth of the Markan Jesus by Pauline elements. All four Gospels have been influenced by Paul. Paul was the first one to write anything down that was later to be considered scripture of the Christians, right? Paul is writing around 45-50 of the Common Era. The Gospel of Mark is written 67 to 70 of the Common Era, to those same congregations that were founded by Paul in those congregations around the Mediterranean. So that has to be made clear. Now, there's two periods that Mark is talking about. Right? You can divide the Gospel of Mark into two distinct periods. The Galilean period, right, of Isa alayhi salam. So the ministry of Isa alayhi salam, according to Mark, is only about 1 year. So he starts when he's 30. By 31, he's already been ascended, right, according to the Gospel of Mark. The vast majority of his ministry, almost the entire year, he's in Galilee. Galilee is in northern Palestine, the province of Galilee. He's in a city called Nazareth. This is called the Galilean ministry. So this is basically the first 8 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. Chapters 1 through 8 is Jesus's Galilean ministry. And the Gospel of Mark begins with Jesus's baptism by John the Baptist. There is no nativity narrative. There's no Molid mentioned of Isa alayhi salam. There's no virgin birth mentioned by the Gospel of Mark. There's no virgin birth. It begins with the baptism of Isa alayhi salam. There's no nativity narrative in the Gospel of Mark. Okay, the nativity narrative comes later in the Gospel of Matthew and in Luke. Mark begins at the baptism. The second half of the Gospel of Mark is the Judean ministry. This is Isa alayhi salam when he goes to the province of Judea, the city of Jerusalem, and he's only there for about a week. So basically 51 weeks he's in Galilee, and 1 week he's in Jerusalem, according to the Gospel of Mark. He enters Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, right? He manages to seize the temple, right? Which again, this is something that is it sort of cuts against the grain of what early Christians would have wanted to have said about Jesus. The early Christians want to say about Jesus that he's God, he's the Son of God, Hellenistic Christians that is, and that he is the Prince of Peace, he turns the other cheek. But now you have this incident of Jesus seizing the temple, right? And this is mentioned in all 4 Gospels, actually twice in the Gospel of John. How does someone seize the temple if not through military means? This is, the week of Passover. There's tens of thousands of Jews in the temple precincts. The Roman centurions everywhere. How does Isa alayhi salam seize the temple if people aren't armed? This is somewhat embarrassing for Christians to talk about, because that's the only logical sort of explanation for what happened. The Gospels say that Isa alayhi salam, he simply went and rode a donkey into Jerusalem. He took a small whip and started turning over tables. But that's not how you seize an entire temple. It must have been done through military means, at least according to Dale Martin, who's a Christian historian at Yale University. So this is kind of an embarrassing sort of thing for Christians, but if you think about it, that's probably what happened. Allahu alam. Anyway, so he enters the city of Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He seizes the temple. So for that entire week, he's teaching in the temple. Right at that time, they don't just let any rabbi into the temple. If he's teaching in the temple, that means he has authority. He has indeed seized the temple through militaristic means. Allahu alam. However, by Good Friday, he's already dead. Right? So he enters the city of Jerusalem on Sunday. He preaches throughout the week. on Friday, which is called Good Friday. By 3 p.m., according to the Gospel of Mark, he dies on the cross, and then 2 days later on Easter Sunday, he's resurrected according to the Gospel of Mark, and then he ascends a short time later, although the ascension is not mentioned by Mark. The ending of Mark is very interesting, and we'll talk about that as well. So basically, again, these are the two periods of the Gospel of Mark. You have the Galilean ministry, then you have the Judean ministry. Now we have major themes of the Gospel of Mark. One of the major themes, as we mentioned earlier, is that Mark believes in an imminent eschaton, right? That the end of time is going to happen during his lifetime, during the lifetime of Isa alayhi salam. This is a central theme in the Gospel of Mark, an imminent eschatology. Eschatology means the study of the last things, right? So like ahadith of akhir zaman. We have a very large literature in our tradition of end of time literature, right? We would say these are eschatological hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The central theme of the Gospel of Mark is an immediate end of time. That's why Mark uses the adverb euthos time and time again, dozens of times in the Gospel of Mark. Mark uses the Greek euthos, which means immediately, suddenly, because he wants to give you that impression that this thing is coming to an end. It's going to be over. Isa alayhi salam is going to return any time now, and it's going to be the end of the world. Also, another theme of the Gospel of Mark is that you have somewhat of this, in our tradition we would say like a nasibi, sort of this sort of hatred of the family of Isa alayhi salam, or this at least this sort of slighting of the family of Isa alayhi salam. And this is apparent in the Gospel of Mark chapter 3 verse 35, when a group of disciples come to Isa alayhi salam and they say, your mother and your brother are waiting outside. And he says, who are my mother and my brother? Whoever does the will of God are my mother, my brother, and my sisters. And this is seen as sort of Isa alayhi salam, according to Mark, slighting his family, which is very, very interesting, because remember, the Khalifa, if you will, of Isa alayhi salam after his ascension was his brother James, right? His brother James was the successor of Isa alayhi salam. But James has no real role in any gospel. Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, you don't come across James at all, really. And it's very, very strange that you don't hear about him. And it's not until the book of Acts where James has a very central role that he is the actual successor of Isa alayhi salam. And don't forget as well, as we mentioned in the last class, that Paul's enemy, if you will, is in fact James. There is this very clear Pauline, Jamesonian tension that happens in the New Testament, that these two men are teaching fundamentally different things, right? And that's going to be made more clear when we study the Pauline corpus of literature. You also have this sort of, I guess we would say in our tradition, kind of Rafidis, kind of this hatred of the disciples of Isa alayhi salam in the Gospel of Mark as well, not only of his family, but of the disciples in general. The disciples in the Gospel of Mark are truly inept people, right? They just don't understand anything. They're always making mistakes in judgment. Jesus is always lecturing them. I mean, it's a really sad situation that the disciples of Isa alayhi salam are really kind of just insulted, looked down upon, people who just simply don't get it. And this might be an indication of Mark's sort of anti-Jewish, anti-Jamesonian sort of orientation or stance he's taken, favoring Paul's position on certain things as well. So the Gospel of Mark is somewhat anti-Jewish in that sense, is that the disciples, because they're Jews, they just don't get Isa alayhi salam at all. So this idea also of supersessionism, that Judaism has effectively been replaced by Christianity, that Judaism really doesn't have any type of reality anymore. Early Christian fathers like Justin Martyr and Origen of Alexandria, they actually believed that the temple, the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era was a direct result of the Jews' disbelief in Isa alayhi salam. Very, very interesting. Another major theme, so you have eschatology, you have anti-Jewishness. Another theme is, it's very secretive. The Gospel of Mark, if you read the Gospel of Mark, you'll find when Isa alayhi salam is extracting demons, for example, he tells those demons, when they bow down to him and say, "You are the Son of the Blessed, you are the Son of David," and Jesus is always saying to them, "Be quiet, don't tell anyone." He commands them not to tell anybody. This is called the messianic secret, and it's found only in the Gospel of Mark. Why is it such a secret? This phrase, messianic secret, was coined by the German scholar William Reed, and there's many theories as to why Jesus is keeping these things a secret while he's in Galilee. One prominent theory is that the Galileans, of course, the Jews in northern Palestine, they were known for two things. They were known for fishing, and they were known for zealotry or insurrectionism against the Roman occupiers. So if Jesus comes out and says, for example, "Yes, I am the Messiah," again, that has political ramifications. It's not just him being a mystic, sort of itinerant teacher. If you say that you're the Messiah, what you're saying basically is you're the king of Israel, in fact, the king of the world, eventually. So this is something that would get him killed very quickly. So this is one of the theories of New Testament scholars as to why Isa alayhi salam is always commanding people not to divulge that he is the actual Messiah. Of course, when Jesus was young and living in Nazareth, he probably remembers what had happened to Judas the Galilean, one of the messianic claimants, who in 6 of the Common Era was crucified by the Romans and a bunch of his men as well for making messianic claims and for general insurrectionism against the Roman Empire. Another reason scholars have surmised that explains the messianic secret is because maybe there just wasn't a lot of Christians at the time of the Gospel of Mark. And so Mark, kind of embarrassed as to why this movement is so fledgling and it's not growing, he has Jesus command people not to divulge his true identity. Allahu Alam. But this is definitely a major theme in the New Testament, in specifically in the Gospel of Mark, exclusively in the Gospel of Mark. So you have eschatology, you have anti-Jewishness, you have the messianic secret. Another theme is the cross, right? The death of Isa alayhi salam, again, according to the Gospel of Mark. In fact, the entire Gospel of Mark is basically an extended passion narrative of Isa alayhi salam. So this is the whole point of the Gospel of Mark, is the death of Isa alayhi salam, that he has to die, right? It's an extended passion, the passion narrative. What does passion narrative mean? It means basically the final week or the final weekend or the final few days of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So remember, when we look at the Gospel of Mark, you have 8 chapters about 51 or so weeks, and then another 8 chapters about 1 week. So this is the focus of the Gospel of Mark, is that final week of the life of Isa alayhi salam. So the cross or the death of Isa alayhi salam, this is the seminal moment of all of history according to Mark. And again, this is influence from Paul. So Paul's Gospel, in Paul's interpretation of what happened to Isa alayhi salam, the cross is very central. He says, for example, in 1 Corinthians 15:17, if Christ is not raised, our faith is in vain. In other words, if Jesus was not killed and resurrected, then there's no point to Christianity. Christianity hinges on this whole idea, this whole concept of a dead Messiah, right? Which Paul recognizes is a contradiction for Jews, because the Jews did not believe that the Messiah was going to be killed, and they still maintain that. And of course, Islam has a very interesting answer to reconcile this problem within Judeo-Christianity. And then we have another theme, which is the parousia, the second coming. So the really, 5 main themes of the Gospel of Mark. You have eschatology, right, in belief in the end of time, which is going to be imminent. You have this sort of anti-Jewishness, the sliding of Jesus' family and his disciples. You have the messianic secret. It's very secretive. Number 4, you have the cross, which is central. And then you have the second coming, right? That Jesus is promising that he'll come again in the lifetime of the disciples. Of course, this did not happen. And we don't ascribe this false prophecy to the actual Isa alayhi salam. This is what the Markan Jesus is saying. And again, the Markan Jesus is influenced by Pauline elements, because the Markan Jesus community was founded by Paul and his adherents. And Paul was verifiably wrong about the second coming of Isa alayhi salam. And also something interesting here about the Gospel of Mark is that it's Christologically anemic. And what do I mean by that? So the concept of Christ in the Gospel of Mark, right, is basically that Jesus is a suffering prophet and that he's a hidden Messiah, right? Jesus is only called God, Son of God, in the New Testament 2 times, right? And that's, basically nothing compared to like the Gospel of John, which we'll get to, and you'll see how much this Christology has evolved. The first time he's called the Son of God is in the very first verse of the Gospel of Mark, right? So if we turn to the Gospel of Mark, and I have the United Bible Society's Greek edition here. So we'll look at the original languages. It's important to look at the actual Greek when we read. So Mark 1:1, right? Chapter 1, verse 1 of Kata Markon. That's what it's called in Greek. It says, Arche tu Evangeliu Iesu Christu, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Huiou Theou, the Son of God. And if you look at the English translation, that's what it says exactly. The gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But in the Greek, the phrase Son of God is in brackets. It's in brackets. And the reason why it's in brackets is because the scholars or the editors of this critical Greek edition, the United Bible Society, is telling us that this phrase was not in the original Gospel of Mark. It was added later, right? That's what they're telling us. Why do they retain it in brackets? Is because Christians traditionally, they like to hear that Jesus is the Son of God. So they'll retain it in the text, but they let the scholars know who read the text that the brackets mean that the scholars don't believe Mark actually wrote that. So the actual first verse of the Gospel of Mark is the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, period. It doesn't say anything about the Son of God. Dr. Broots Metzger, who is used to be the head of the United Bible Society, he says this was a scribal expansion, right? A scribal expansion means that it's a forgery. Somebody later on, a scribe, proto-Orthodox scribe, later on went back into a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark and added Son of God. Why? Because again, the Gospel of Mark is Christologically anemic. It's very weak in its Christology, right? It's very weak. So in order to bulk it up a little bit, right, this phrase Son of God was entered into the text. If you read again the Gospel of John, it's very high Christology. Jesus is called the Son of God in many places. Jesus is called God in the prologue of the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God, right? So there's very high Christology, but Mark is a very frail, anemic Christology. So the proto-Orthodox bishops and fathers and scholars, they didn't like that about the Gospel of Mark. So in order to bulk it up a little bit, make it more orthodox, right? They went back into the Gospel of Mark and they put in these 2 words, Huiou Theou, the Son of God, to Mark chapter 1, verse 1. Last class we talked about the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest Greek version of the New Testament on earth, right? Which was found at St. Catherine's Monastery, 320. It was written in 375 of the Common Era. It was found by a German scholar named Tischendorf in the 19th century. And if you read Mark 1:1, indeed, it does not say Son of God. It says Arche tu Evangeliu Iesu Christu, without the phrase Son of God. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, period. So the oldest and best manuscripts of the New Testament, of the Gospel of Mark, do not contain the phrase Son of God. Okay, so we've established now that there has been scribal fabrications made to the New Testament. This is just one example. We'll come across many other examples as well, especially when we talk about the end of the Gospel of Mark. There are actually 4 endings to the Gospel of Mark. So again, the Gospel of Mark is, Christologically anemic. If you look at the actual crucifixion of Isa alayhi salam according to the Gospel of Mark, it's very, very kind of different than what we have in Matthew, Luke, and John. The crucifixion of Isa alayhi salam according to the Gospel of Mark is kind of pathetic. He's interviewed at his trial. They ask him, "Are you the Messiah?" He says, "It is as you say," and then he doesn't say another word until the very end when he's on the cross, and he cries out this, what's known as the cry of dereliction, when he says, "Ilahi, Ilahi, lama sabachthani," my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And of course, Imam Ghazali, in his Radd al-Jamil, who basically takes the text and says the text is fine, the tahrif, the corruption of the New Testament comes in the ma'na. And he says here that this cannot be Isa alayhi salam. Isa alayhi salam would never say such a statement, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Right? So we compare now, when we get to Matthew, Luke, and John, we look at the passion narratives of all 4 Gospels, we'll notice that they're very different. They might initially seem basically the same because we're used to reading the Gospels what's known as horizontally. In other words, we start with Mark, then Matthew, then Luke, then John. But the real way to read the Gospels, according to Bart Ehrman, is to read them vertically. In other words, read the passion narrative of Mark, and then immediately read the passion narrative in Matthew, and then in Luke, and in John, and then you can compare, right, how different they really are, because they are different, and there are marked differences between them that are very significant. So, next time, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to talk more about the Gospel of Mark. We're going to talk about Mark's source. Where is Mark getting his information from? Right? So this is very, very important. And we're going to talk about what's known as the synoptic problem, because we're going to move from the Gospel of Mark towards the Gospel of Matthew. And why is Matthew different than Mark? Why is Luke different than Mark? How did they use Mark, if they used Mark at all? So that's next time, inshallah ta'ala. Wa sallallahu sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Sallallahu sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Continuing with our class on the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. Last time we talked about the Gospel of Mark, and we talked about how Mark is divided into 2 periods, the Galilean ministry and the Judean ministry. We also talked about something very important, major themes of the Gospel of Mark. We said some of the major themes are eschatology, an expectation of the end of time to come immediately. And we said the reason for that is because of things that were happening around the world, major natural disasters. You have persecution of Christians in Rome by the Emperor Nero. You have the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. You have rejection of Isa alayhi salam by the vast majority of the Jews. So this immediate eschatology. We also said another major theme is the anti-Jewishness of the Gospel of Mark. And that's primarily because the Gospel of Mark is reflective of Pauline Christianity or Hellenistic Christianity, as opposed to a more Semitic or Jewish Christianity that was found in Jerusalem at that time under the guidance of James or Yaqub had Sadiq, who is the brother and successor of Isa alayhi salam. So very clearly we have 2 different distinct strands of Christianity, even from an early period. You have Pauline Hellenistic Christianity, which eventually became the Orthodox Christianity, and then you have the Jamesonian Semitic, or Ebionite, as sometimes is called, Tawheed Christianity, which believed that Isa alayhi salam was simply the Messiah and a prophet of God. And of course we have that reconfirmed in the Quran. Why did Pauline Christianity win? The primary reason is because when the emperor, the Roman emperor, becomes Christian, he becomes a Pauline Christian, and that was Constantine in 318 of the Common Era. If Eusebius's ecclesiastical history is correct, and there's a lot of question whether it is correct, but according to Eusebius, Constantine was fighting his enemies at the Milvian Bridge, and suddenly he looked at the sun, because he used to worship the sun. He worshipped the Sol Invictus, and he saw a cross in the sun. In fact, it was actually not a cross, it was the Chi Rho, the first two letters of the name of Christ, which happens also to be the symbol of Cronus, the father of Zeus. And when he saw that, he took it as a sign because he heard a voice that said, in hoc vince, or in hoc signo vince,